When I speak today of the day the empath stops being accessible, I am not speaking of an act of rebellion, nor of withdrawal born from bitterness, nor of the cold indifference that belongs to resentment. I am speaking of something far more ancient and far more decisive, something that occurs not in the realm of conscious intention but in the deeper strata of the psyche, where decisions are made long before the ego understands them. There comes a moment in certain individuals, often those whom we call empathic, sensitive, attuned, when the unconscious quietly closes a door that has been open far too long, and when that door closes, the world they have been living in no longer functions as it once did. You must understand that accessibility is not merely a social behavior, it is a psychic posture. To be accessible means that the boundaries between one's inner life and the outer demands of others are porous, permeable, often undefined. The empath does not merely listen, they receive. They do not merely notice, they absorb. Over years, sometimes decades, this posture becomes an identity. The empath comes to believe, unconsciously, that their value lies in their availability, in their responsiveness, in their capacity to be reached at any moment, emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually. They become, without realizing it, a kind of psychic commons, a shared territory upon which others walk freely. In the language of depth psychology, this posture often originates in early life. The child who learned that safety depended upon attunement, that love depended upon responsiveness, that harmony depended upon self-erasure, grows into the adult who remains perpetually reachable. The psyche learns early that to withdraw is dangerous, that to be unavailable is to risk abandonment, chaos, or guilt, and so the empath becomes skilled at remaining open, even when openness wounds them, even when accessibility drains them, even when it fragments the integrity of the self. But the psyche is not endlessly tolerant of such imbalance. The unconscious is not sentimental, it is regulatory. It seeks wholeness, not goodness, and when a certain threshold is crossed, when the cost of accessibility becomes too great, the psyche initiates a correction. This correction rarely announces itself dramatically. It does not come with a declaration or a plan. More often, it arrives as a subtle fatigue, a strange numbness, a quiet resistance to answering, explaining, engaging. The empath does not decide to become inaccessible. Rather, they discover that they already are. At this point, many experience confusion. They say, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just don't have the energy to respond anymore. But this is not pathology. It is not depression in the usual sense. It is the psyche withdrawing libido from a pattern that has become destructive. It is a reallocation of psychic energy away from endless availability and toward the restoration of inner order. Here we encounter an important distinction. The ego believes that accessibility is a moral virtue. The unconscious sees it as a function, and functions are altered when they no longer serve life. When the empath stops being accessible, it is not an act against others, it is an act for the self. The self, in Jungian terms, is the regulating center of the psyche, the totality that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. When the self intervenes, it often does so by dismantling roles that the ego has mistaken for identity. I have seen in my analytic work that when this shift begins, the external world reacts with surprising intensity. Those who relied upon the empath's availability experience anxiety, confusion, even anger. Systems that depended upon their emotional labor begin to destabilize. Relationships that were held together by the empath's constant presence reveal their underlying asymmetry. This is why it appears from the outside that everything changes, but in truth, what changes is not reality itself. It is the removal of an unconscious support that had been compensating for dysfunction. We must speak here of the shadow, the empath. By remaining accessible, often carries not only their own emotional material, but also the unintegrated shadow of others. They become a container for what others cannot face within themselves. When the empath withdraws, these disowned aspects return to their rightful owners. This return is rarely welcomed. Projection collapses, and with it the illusion of harmony. The empath is suddenly perceived as cold, selfish, distant, when in fact they have merely ceased to perform a psychic labor that was never truly theirs. In dreams, this transition often appears symbolically. One may dream of locked doors, of unanswered phones, of being unable to speak, or of watching others shout from a distance while the dreamer remains behind glass. These are not signs of regression. They are images of differentiation. The psyche is drawing a boundary where none existed before. The dream is saying, access is no longer granted by default. Well, this moment is deeply unsettling for the ego because it contradicts the persona the empath has worn for so long. The persona, as you know, is the mask we present to the world, shaped by expectation and adaptation. For the empath, this mask is often one of perpetual openness, kindness, responsiveness. When accessibility ends, the persona cracks. The individual may fear they are becoming someone they do not recognize, but what is actually happening is that the persona is dissolving to make room for a more authentic relation between inner and outer life. It is crucial to emphasize that this withdrawal is not the same as isolation. Isolation is a defensive reaction of the ego, often driven by fear or resentment. Inaccessibility, in the Jungian sense, is a structural realignment. The empath does not disappear from the world. They simply cease to be endlessly reachable. They begin to choose when and how they engage, guided not by guilt or obligation, but by an emerging inner authority. This inner authority is not loud. It does not argue. It does not justify itself. It manifests as a quiet certainty, a bodily knowing, a sense that certain demands no longer penetrate. The empath may find that they no longer feel compelled to explain themselves. Words fall away. Silence becomes sufficient. This silence is not empty. It is full of psychic presence. And it is precisely this presence that unsettles those who were accustomed to easy access. At this stage, the empath often encounters profound guilt. This guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing, it is the residue of an old conditioning. The psyche is testing whether the individual will retreat back into accessibility to relieve discomfort, or whether they will tolerate the tension of transformation. If the empath can remain with this tension without collapsing back into old patterns, a new configuration of the self begins to emerge. Everything changes because the empath is no longer functioning as a psychic extension of others. Energy that once flowed outward without limit now circulates inward, nourishing creativity, intuition, and depth. The individual may feel strangely more alive, even as their social world feels smaller. This contraction is temporary. What is being dismantled is not connection itself, but unconscious enmeshment. In alchemical terms, this phase resembles the nigredo, the darkening, the withdrawal of light before transformation. The empath may feel invisible, misunderstood, even erased, but invisibility can be protective. Inaccessibility can be sacred. Many spiritual traditions recognize the necessity of retreat, of withdrawal from the profane demands of the collective, in order to encounter the deeper truths of the soul. When the empath stops being accessible, the world loses a mirror that reflected its needs back to it. What remains is the raw encounter with oneself. This is why resistance arises. This is why accusations emerge. But from the standpoint of the psyche, this moment is not a collapse, it is a correction. And so I say to you, if you find yourself unable to answer, unable to engage as before, unable to remain open in the same way, do not rush to interpret this as failure. Ask instead what ancient pattern is finally ending. Ask what part of you has grown strong enough to close the gate. The psyche does not remove access lightly. When it does, it is because something far more important is asking to be born. When the empath ceases to be accessible, we must look beyond the personal story and enter the archetypal field, because what unfolds at this stage is not merely an individual adjustment, but the activation of forces that have existed in the human psyche since its earliest formations. The empath is not simply a personality type, it is an archetypal position, most often aligned with what I would call the wounded caretaker, the bearer of emotional continuity within a fractured system. This position is rarely chosen consciously. It is assigned, often silently, within the family constellation, and later reinforced by society itself. In early psychic development, the empath frequently becomes the emotional stabilizer of the household. Sometimes this occurs in response to an anxious mother, sometimes an emotionally absent or unpredictable father, sometimes a general atmosphere in which the child senses that their attunement is necessary for survival. The child learns, long before language forms, that being reachable is a way of keeping the world intact. The psyche records this as a law. If I remain open, others will not fall apart. This law then migrates into adulthood, where it governs friendships, romantic bonds, workplaces, and even spiritual communities. Here, the archetype of the caretaker fuses with the shadow of authority. Authority, in its healthy form, is the capacity to delimit, to say yes and no from an inner center. But for the empath, authority has often been projected outward: parents, partners, institutions, and even the suffering of others come to dictate the empath's movements. The empath's own authority remains unconscious, unclaimed, residing in the shadow as something dangerous or forbidden. To assert limits feels like betrayal. To become inaccessible feels like abandonment enacted upon others. When the psyche initiates withdrawal, it is often because this shadow authority is demanding recognition. What has been repressed begins to rise. The empath feels an unfamiliar firmness, sometimes even a hardness, and this alarms the ego. They may fear they are becoming cruel or indifferent. But cruelty is not the emergence of authority. Cruelty is what happens when authority has been denied for too long and returns in distorted form. The healthy return of authority is quiet, almost impersonal. It does not seek to punish. It simply refuses to be endlessly penetrated. At this point, relational systems begin to reveal their true structure. Relationships that were ostensibly mutual are exposed as asymmetrical. The empath notices that when they stop initiating contact, silence follows. When they stop offering emotional labor, the connection thins or collapses entirely. This is deeply painful, not because the empath has lost something real, but because an illusion dissolves. The illusion was that love existed independently of their accessibility. In analytic work, this moment often coincides with dreams of collapse or exposure, a house with no walls, a bridge that vanishes mid-crossing, a crowd that turns away when the dreamer stops speaking. These images reflect the psyche's recognition that the empath's presence was functioning as psychic infrastructure. When that infrastructure is withdrawn, what remains must either reorganize or disintegrate. This is where resistance intensifies. Others may attempt to re-establish access through guilt, urgency, or accusation. You've changed, they say, and they are correct, but what they often mean is, you are no longer available in the way that served my unconscious needs. The empath, if still entangled in old conditioning, may feel compelled to defend themselves, to explain, to reassure, yet every explanation reopens the door that the psyche has just closed. The true test at this stage is not whether the empath can justify their withdrawal, but whether they can tolerate being misunderstood. Misunderstanding is a crucible. It strips away the persona's last defenses. To be seen as selfish when one has spent a lifetime sacrificing is almost unbearable. And yet, this is precisely the moment when individuation accelerates. Individuation, as I have often said, is not a moral achievement but a psychological necessity. It is the process by which the individual becomes what they are, rather than what the collective requires them to be. The father and mother complexes play a decisive role here. If the empath grew up with a mother who required emotional caretaking, withdrawal may evoke deep unconscious fear of her collapse, even if she is no longer present. If the father was absent or weak, the emergence of inner authority may feel alien, ungrounded, even dangerous. The empath may oscillate between firmness and collapse, testing whether they are permitted to exist without constant responsiveness. In this oscillation, fatigue often appears, but this fatigue is not merely physical or emotional. It is the exhaustion of a psychic pattern that has reached its limit. The unconscious is withdrawing energy from a role that has become obsolete. Attempts to force oneself back into accessibility at this stage often result in anxiety, somatic symptoms, or depression. These are signals that the psyche will no longer support the old configuration. Something else begins to happen as well. The empath may notice a sharpening of perception without the constant noise of others' emotions. Their own inner imagery becomes clearer. Dreams intensify, symbols emerge with greater coherence, creativity may awaken unexpectedly. This is not coincidence. Energy that was once dispersed outward is now available for inner development. The psyche, no longer preoccupied with maintaining external equilibrium, turns inward toward meaning from the perspective of those around the empath. This transformation can feel threatening. Systems prefer predictability. When the empath was accessible, they functioned as a buffer, absorbing conflict, smoothing tension, mediating unspoken anxieties. Without this buffer, unresolved issues surface, conflicts escalate, power dynamics shift. It may appear that the empath's withdrawal has caused chaos. In truth, the chaos was always there. What has changed is that it is no longer being managed silently. This is why I say that everything changes, not because the empath has done something dramatic, but because they have stopped doing something invisible. The invisible labor of emotional containment is withdrawn, and the structure reveals its fractures. This is not destruction, it is revelation. There is a temptation at this stage to romanticize isolation, to believe that withdrawal itself is the goal. This would be a misunderstanding. Inaccessibility is not an endpoint, it is a transitional state. The psyche is not seeking permanent separation but conscious relation. Only when access is no longer automatic can it become meaningful. Only when boundaries exist can genuine encounter occur. The empath who remains inaccessible out of fear or resentment stagnates. The empath who allows inaccessibility to clarify their inner authority prepares the ground for a new form of connection. This new connection is not based on need or obligation, but on resonance. It does not demand constant availability. It respects rhythm, silence, and individuality. At this point, the empath often feels as though they are standing at the edge of an unknown territory. The old maps no longer apply. The familiar role has dissolved, but the new form has not yet fully emerged. This liminal state is uncomfortable, but it is also sacred. In many mythological traditions, the hero must withdraw into the forest, the desert, or the underworld before returning transformed. The empath's inaccessibility functions in the same way. It is a descent, not an escape. What is being born is not hardness but sovereignty. Sovereignty of the psyche means that energy flows according to inner necessity rather than external demand. When this sovereignty stabilizes, the empath no longer fears being accessible because access is now chosen, not compelled. They can engage without losing themselves. They can listen without absorbing. They can care without disappearing. But before this integration occurs, the old world must be allowed to fall away. Relationships that cannot survive the empath's inaccessibility were never truly relational. They were functional. Systems that collapse without the empath's constant presence reveal their dependency. This knowledge is painful, but it is also liberating. The psyche does not demand that the empath become less compassionate. It demands that compassion be grounded in wholeness rather than sacrifice. The day the empath stops being accessible is the day the psyche begins to reclaim its center. As the empath remains within this newly formed inaccessibility, something subtle but decisive begins to occur in the deeper layers of the psyche. What was once experienced as absence becomes presence. Silence, which initially felt like loss, begins to reveal its density. The unconscious, no longer flooded by the emotional material of others, starts to speak in its own language. This is often the phase in which dreams take on a particular intensity, not chaotic, but precise, as though the psyche is carefully instructing the ego in a new orientation toward life. Many empaths report dreams of thresholds during this time. Doors appear repeatedly, sometimes locked, sometimes closing on their own, sometimes guarded by figures who do not speak. Keys may be present, but the dreamer does not always know how to use them. These images are not metaphors invented by the mind, they are spontaneous expressions of the psyche's effort to establish boundaries where none existed before. The door is not meant to keep the empath imprisoned, it exists to regulate entry. For the first time, the psyche is distinguishing between inside and outside with clarity. In some dreams, the empath stands on one side of glass, watching others gesticulate, plead, or accuse from the other side. The empath may feel calm in the dream, even as the figures outside appear agitated. This calm is significant. It suggests that the psyche has already accepted the withdrawal, even if the waking ego continues to struggle. The unconscious often completes its work before consciousness catches up. The ego experiences this delay as confusion or guilt, but in truth, it is simply learning to follow a decision that has already been made at a deeper level. It is here that the question of power must be addressed, because inaccessibility alters power dynamics in a way that few anticipate. Power, in psychological terms, is not domination but influence. The empath's influence was once diffuse, spread across many relationships, many needs, many emotional exchanges. When accessibility ends, influence condenses. It becomes concentrated, and this concentration is often experienced by others as a sudden shift, even a threat. Those who were accustomed to immediate access begin to feel destabilized. They may increase their attempts to regain contact, escalating urgency, emotional intensity, or moral pressure, but these attempts often fail, not because the empath has hardened, but because the psyche has removed the energetic charge that once animated these interactions. Words that once compelled now fall flat. Emotional appeals that once penetrated now dissolve at the boundary. The empath may be surprised by their own lack of reaction. This absence of reaction is not numbness, it is differentiation. Differentiation is a core movement of individuation. It is the process by which the individual recognizes what belongs to them and what does not. The empath, having spent years or a lifetime confusing resonance with responsibility, now begins to sense this distinction viscerally. They feel it in the body, as a tightening or relaxing, a yes or a no that arises before thought. This bodily knowing is the re-emergence of instinct, long suppressed by adaptation. At this stage, the empath often stops explaining themselves. Explanations belong to the old world, the world in which access had to be justified, in which boundaries required permission. The psyche, however, does not argue, it simply withdraws energy. When the empath attempts to explain their inaccessibility, they often feel drained afterward, as though something vital has leaked away. Silence, by contrast, feels oddly nourishing. This is an important diagnostic sign. The psyche is signaling which direction leads toward integration. There is also, at this point, a confrontation with loneliness, but it is not the loneliness the empath has known before. Earlier loneliness occurred even in the presence of others, a loneliness born of being unseen while being useful. The new loneliness arises from standing apart, from no longer being embedded in constant relational exchange. This loneliness is cleaner, sharper, and more honest. It does not accuse, it does not beg, it simply exists, asking to be endured rather than avoided. If the empath can remain with this loneliness without rushing to fill it, something unexpected occurs. The inner world expands. Symbols that once appeared only in dreams begin to inform waking life. Images, intuitions, and insights arise spontaneously. The empath may feel drawn to solitude not as escape but as communion with something deeper. This is the psyche reclaiming its symbolic function, which had been overshadowed by ceaseless interpersonal attunement. From the outside, this period may look like withdrawal or disengagement. From the inside, it feels like alignment. The empath is no longer oriented primarily toward external signals, but toward an inner axis. This axis does not negate relationship, it reorders it. Relationships that survive this reordering do so on entirely new terms. They are no longer maintained by accessibility, but by mutual presence. It is important to note that the psyche does not eliminate compassion during this phase. What it removes is compulsive compassion, the kind that arises from fear, guilt, or unconscious identification with others' pain. In its place emerges a quieter, more discriminating form of care. The empath may find that they can witness suffering without being consumed by it. This capacity is not indifference, it is maturity. The shadow, too, undergoes transformation here. Earlier, the empath's shadow contained anger, refusal, and authority, all of which were deemed unacceptable. As inaccessibility stabilizes, these elements integrate. Anger becomes clarity, refusal becomes discernment, authority becomes self-respect. The empath no longer fears their own firmness because it no longer threatens their sense of goodness. Goodness and boundaries cease to be opposites. This integration often brings a profound sense of relief, accompanied by grief. The grief is not only for lost relationships, but for the self that endured so much in order to remain accessible. Memories may surface, moments of quiet self-betrayal long forgotten. The empath may feel sorrow for the child who learned to be reachable at all costs. This grief is not regressive, it is reparative. The psyche is mourning what was sacrificed in order to survive. As this mourning completes itself, the empath's presence in the world changes. They speak less, but when they do, their words carry weight. They engage less frequently, but with greater authenticity. Others may notice that interactions feel different, more grounded, more real. Those who seek access for unconscious reasons drift away. Those capable of genuine encounter remain. The day the empath stops being accessible is not marked by a single event. It is a process unfolding over time. often invisibly, but once it has begun, it cannot truly be reversed. Attempts to return to old patterns feel increasingly hollow. The psyche has tasted a different configuration, one in which energy is conserved rather than depleted, in which boundaries support rather than isolate. We are approaching now the final movement of this transformation. What remains is to understand how this inaccessibility resolves not into withdrawal, but into a new form of relatedness, one that emerges not from need, but from choice. In this final stage, the empath does not disappear from the world, they re enter it, but on different terms. When the empath has remained long enough within this state of inaccessibility, something decisive resolves itself within the psyche. What at first appeared as withdrawal, loss, or contraction reveals its true nature as reorganization. The psyche, having withdrawn energy from compulsive accessibility, now begins to redistribute it according to a new internal logic. This is the moment when the empath discovers that they are not disappearing from the world, but returning to it in a fundamentally altered form. What changes most profoundly at this stage is the quality of relatedness. The empath no longer meets others from a position of unconscious obligation. They are no longer governed by the silent command to soothe, to rescue, to anticipate. Instead, they encounter the world from an inner center that has weight. Presence replaces availability, and presence, unlike availability, cannot be demanded. It can only be met. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Availability belongs to the realm of function. Presence belongs to the realm of being. When the empath was accessible, they were often valued for what they provided emotionally, psychologically, or energetically. Now, what they offer is something far less manipulable. They offer themselves as they are, not as they are needed. This shift unsettles those who remain oriented toward function rather than being. But for those capable of genuine encounter, it creates a new depth of connection. At this point, the empath may notice that fewer relationships remain, but those that do feel strangely alive. Conversation slows, silence becomes tolerable, even fertile. There is less urgency, less emotional bargaining. Boundaries no longer need to be announced. They are felt. The empath does not guard them anxiously. They simply exist, and others sense them instinctively. This is the mark of integration. A boundary that must be defended is not yet fully internalized. A boundary that quietly holds has become part of the psyche's structure. It is here that the empath often experiences a return of joy, but not the excited joy of approval or connection regained. This joy is quieter, more grounded. It arises from alignment. Energy flows without friction. The empath may feel more at home in their own body, more settled in their own rhythms. Time itself may feel different, less pressured, less fragmented. This is not because external demands have vanished, but because the psyche no longer disperses itself endlessly in response to them.